Since the moment I bought my shed, I knew I would eventually have to deal with unexpected issues. What I didn't expect, however, was that my biggest nuisance wouldn't be something related to structure, taxes, or maintenance, but rather an inconvenient neighbor who seemed to believe my property was an extension of public parking. This neighbor, whom I now affectionately refer to as Bogan Karen, was the type of person who could turn any trivial situation into a personal drama. For those who aren't familiar with the term, a bogan in Australia refers to a person who combines a lack of awareness with an authoritative attitude and an exaggerated sense of entitlement over everything around them. Now imagine a bogan with the classic mindset of a Karen, a dangerous combination. The first time I noticed her car in my shed, I thought it was a mistake, perhaps a lost visitor or someone who had stopped for a moment. But when I saw that the vehicle was still there the next day, I realized something was wrong. At first I tried to be reasonable. I walked up to her house and knocked on the door. When Karen opened it, I immediately realized I was dealing with someone who thrived on unnecessary confrontation. Before I could even speak, she was already looking at me with her arms crossed, a look of boredom and irritation plastered on her face. "What is it?" she asked, as if I were some kind of inconvenience. I took a deep breath and politely explained that I noticed her car parked in my shed, and that it wasn't allowed. To my surprise, her response was as generic as possible. "Oh, I just parked for a minute. I'll move it soon." Since I was still trying to keep the peace, I decided to give her the benefit of the doubt, and believed her. I left and carried on with my day. However, the next morning, there was her car again, and this time, it seemed like it had spent the night there. I went back to her house, and the reaction was almost identical to the previous one, but with an added touch of cheekiness. "Oh, sorry, I forgot. But what's the problem? Your shed has so much spare space." It was then that I realized I wasn't dealing with someone rational. The fact that I was the owner of the property and had full rights to it seemed irrelevant to Karen. In her mind, my permission wasn't necessary because, for her, available space meant free space to be used as she pleased. The situation repeated itself several times, each time with more absurd excuses. There was one day when she said her son needed a safe place to park because the streets were too busy. Another time, she claimed her garage was full and that it was just a temporary emergency. What seemed like a 5-minute favor began to turn into an annoying habit. When I tried to be firmer and said I didn't want her parking there anymore, her attitude changed completely. The casual tone disappeared, and in its place emerged an air of indignation. "Wow, how rude! I thought neighbors helped each other out. You don't even use that space all the time." "Oh, of course, because apparently, if I'm not constantly inside the shed, it stops being my property and becomes a community asset." It was at that point that I began to lose my patience. I made it clear that from that moment on, any car left in my shed without permission would be towed. She rolled her eyes and said I was overreacting. But curiously, for a few weeks, Karen stopped parking there. I thought she finally got the message. Little did I know that this brief truce was just the calm before the storm. And then the fateful Friday arrived. When I went to the shed, ready to organize a few things before the weekend, I encountered a scene that made me completely lose my patience. Her car was there again, but this time, there was no sign of Karen nearby. She wasn't just testing my patience, now she was directly challenging me. I stood there for a few seconds, just staring at Karen's car inside my shed, trying to process the audacity of the situation. It was as if she was testing me, seeing how far she could push before I finally exploded. And to be honest, I was already pretty close to my limit. The engine was cold, indicating that the car had been there for hours, maybe even the whole day. What bothered me was not just the fact that it was parked there without my permission, but the calmness with which Karen did this, as if my property were part of public space. No attempt to hide the vehicle, no note explaining the reason, nothing. I took a deep breath, trying to contain the growing irritation. Maybe she was nearby and could move the car immediately. I took out my phone and sent a polite message. "Your car is in my shed again. Can you please move it?" I put the phone in my pocket and waited. Nothing. 5 minutes passed. 10. I took out my phone and checked if the message had been delivered. Yes. Read? No. I decided to call. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Voicemail. I started to feel something was wrong. Maybe she had forgotten her phone at home, or she was busy and couldn't answer. But at the same time, I couldn't ignore the possibility that Karen was simply ignoring me on purpose. If that was the case, then it was no longer just a matter of lack of awareness. It was pure disrespect. Still giving her the benefit of the doubt, I decided to go to her house and knock on the door. I waited. Nothing. I rang the doorbell. Silence. It was then that one of the older neighbors on the street appeared on the porch, taking a sip of his morning coffee, and cast a curious glance in my direction. "Looking for Karen?" he asked, with a slight hint of amusement in his voice. "Yes," I replied. "Have you seen her around?" The man let out a short laugh and shook his head. "Ah, she went out last night with some friends. I think they went to a resort or something for the weekend." I spent a few seconds processing that information. "You're telling me she went away and left her car in my shed?" The neighbor shrugged. "Seems like it." That's when I realized that Karen never intended to move the car quickly. All that talk about, "I'll get it out in a minute," was just a lame excuse. She parked there because she thought it was convenient, and simply didn't care about the impact it had on me. The irritation I'd been holding back for weeks finally reached its limit. She left her car on my property without permission, and vanished, without even giving me the chance to stop her. I went back to the shed and stopped in front of the vehicle again. I knew I had two options: be the reasonable person I always was, wait for Karen to come back, confront her, and inevitably hear more ridiculous excuses, or do what she deserved, make sure she understood that my property wasn't free parking. I looked around the shed, observing the huge metal doors and the solid structure of the place, and then an idea began to form in my mind. A simple idea, so obvious that I couldn't believe I hadn't thought of it before. If Karen thought she could park in my space without permission, then I would simply ensure she couldn't leave until she learned her lesson. With a slight smile on my face, I walked to the shed door, checked that all the windows were tightly closed, and, with the utmost calm, locked the door and put the key in my pocket. Problem solved. If she wanted to treat my shed like private parking, then she could deal with the consequences. I had plans for the weekend and wasn't going to change my routine to sort out her irresponsibility. Before leaving, I made sure to take a photo of the car inside the shed, just in case I needed it as proof later. Who knows? Maybe Karen would try to come up with some lie to play the victim? Better to be safe. I locked everything up and left without looking back. On the way home, I felt a slight weight on my conscience. Not because I thought I was in the wrong, but because I knew that when Karen came back and realized what had happened, the meltdown would be epic. But you know what? That problem wasn't mine anymore. The sense of relief as I walked out of the shed, knowing Karen's car was locked inside, was almost therapeutic. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had some control over the situation. I had already been patient, polite, and reasonable, but none of that worked. So if she wanted to act as if my property was public parking, I would treat her like any other illegally parked car. It would be towed until the owner got their act together. On the way home, I started imagining the possible scenarios for when Karen returned. At best, she would acknowledge her mistake and never try something like that again. But realistically, I already knew that wasn't going to happen. She wasn't the type of person to admit she was wrong. Most likely she would be furious, throw herself into the victim role, and try to deflect the blame onto me. Maybe she'd even call the police, as if I were the criminal for not wanting her to park where she shouldn't. And you know what? I was ready for that. As soon as I got home, I made a coffee and sat on the couch, picking up my phone to check messages. No sign of Karen, no missed calls, no desperate attempts to communicate with me. That only confirmed that she really had gone away for the weekend without a second thought for her car. The level of disregard amazed me. I could have reached out again, insisted she sort it out before leaving. But then I realized it wasn't my problem. I had already warned her before that I didn't want her car there. She chose to ignore that. Now she could deal with the consequences. So, with the calmness of someone who just got rid of an annoyance, I packed my bags, grabbed my car keys, and set off for my own weekend. The open road, the wind in my face, the feeling of freedom. It was incredible how a simple act of passive revenge had drastically improved my mood. My destination was a remote cabin on the coast, where I could relax without thinking about annoying neighbors or unnecessary problems. A friend of mine was already there waiting for me with a cooler full of beers. The plan was to spend 2 days away from any stress, and that's exactly what I did. I spent the whole Saturday fishing, chatting, and enjoying the silence. It was funny how, after weeks of stressing about Karen, I just needed a little distance to realize how ridiculous the situation was. But I knew that silence wouldn't last forever. On Sunday morning, while having coffee on the cabin porch, my phone buzzed on the table. I picked up the device and saw what I had been expecting. Messages from Karen. Lots of messages from Karen. I laughed to myself and unlocked the phone, ready to have some fun with her outrage. The first message was surprisingly calm. Karen, hi, can you open the shed? I need to get my car. Oh, so now it was my problem? I waited a few minutes before replying, just to let her sweat a bit. Me, I'm not in town. I'll be back tomorrow. That's when her mask slipped and the meltdown began. Karen, what? How can you not be in town? My car is trapped in there. Karen, you can't do this. Karen, if you don't come and open that damn shed right now, I'm calling the police. Karen, I have rights. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The problem with people like Karen is that they believe the world revolves around them. For her, the simple fact that I wasn't available at that exact moment was a crime against her existence. So instead of stressing out, I just put my phone on silent mode and continued enjoying my coffee. 2 hours later, while we were preparing lunch, I decided to check my phone again. As expected, more furious messages. But what really made me laugh was this one. Karen, I just called the police. You criminal! Ah, of course. Now I was a car thief. I picked up my phone and replied, Me. Great. What did the police say? I waited. 10 minutes. 20. No response. Because obviously the police had said nothing. I could imagine the conversation. Karen calling in a rage, shouting about how her car was impounded. The officer asking where the car was impounded. Her explaining that it was on someone else's private property. The silence on the other end must have been awkward. I knew that, legally, I hadn't done anything wrong. My shed was my private property. She left the car there without my permission. The police weren't going to do anything for her, and now Karen knew that too. The best part of this plan wasn't just the revenge itself, but the lesson Karen was learning the hard way. She spent the entire weekend without her car, probably relying on friends or spending money on Uber to get around. And me? I was completely relaxed, sitting on a porch, watching the waves and having a cold beer. Finally, around 5 p.m. on Sunday, Karen sent one last message. Karen, when exactly are you coming back? Ah, now the tone had changed. No screaming, no threats, just pure and desperate submission. Me, Monday morning. I can open the shed after 9 a.m. No response. She knew she had no choice. I woke up early that Monday even though I didn't need to. It was the first time in a long time that I was actually looking forward to a confrontation. By this point, Karen must have been boiling with rage, counting down the seconds until I opened the shed and freed her from her own mistake. I got up leisurely, took a shower, and went to the kitchen to make some coffee. While the coffee maker was doing its job, I walked over to the living room window and peeked outside. Karen wasn't there yet, which surprised me a little. Had she finally learned something and given up on creating more drama? But of course, that would be asking too much. 5 minutes later, as I was bringing the cup of coffee to my lips, I heard heavy, hurried footsteps in my backyard. And then, bam, bam, bam. Someone started banging on my door so hard that for a moment I thought it was a debt collector or a cop coming to arrest me. But no, it was just Karen in hurricane mode. The knocking was frantic, impatient, as if every second of waiting was torture. I was expecting a meltdown, but honestly, the level of her fury exceeded my expectation. I set the cup down on the counter and went to the door, taking a deep breath before opening it. I needed to stay calm to avoid falling into the shouting trap. As soon as I unlocked and pulled the handle, Karen practically stormed onto my porch, her face red and her eyes sparkling. "Open the shed now!" she yelled, not even bothering with a good morning or any attempt to seem civilized. I crossed my arms and stared at her for a moment, absorbing all her frustration. "Good morning, Karen. Did you sleep well?" she huffed, throwing her arms up as if I were the most annoying human on the planet. "You know I didn't." "Really? Why not?" "Because my car is impounded in your shed, you idiot." "Ah, I see. But technically, the problem isn't mine. You parked there without my permission, remember?" Karen clenched her fists and took a deep breath, clearly trying not to explode further. "I was traveling." "Yes, I know. You made that very clear when you ignored me on Friday." She squinted and pointed her finger at me, as if she was about to cast a deadly spell. "You could not just lock my car in there. That's property kidnapping. I could call the police." I couldn't help but let out a short laugh. "Funny you say that because wasn't that exactly what you did? You called the police, right?" Karen shut her mouth for a second, clearly taken aback. And what did they say? I asked, raising an eyebrow. She looked away and crossed her arms, mumbling something unintelligible. What? I didn't catch that. They said they couldn't do anything. Wow, how shocking. Who would have thought that parking a car on someone else's property without permission wouldn't give you automatic rights over the place? Karen gritted her teeth. I could see pure hatred in her eyes, mixed with something that looked a lot like shame. She knew she had no argument, knew she was wrong, but admitting that? Never. Look, I just want my car, okay? Let's end this. I sighed and finally took the keys out of my pocket. I'll open it, but with one condition. What? You never park in my shed again. Never. Not for a minute. Not in emergencies. Not because there was nowhere else. She rolled her eyes dramatically. Oh my God. Fine. Now open the damn thing. I gave a half smile and walked to the shed, hearing her hurried footsteps behind me. I was enjoying every second of this moment. I unlocked the door slowly, savoring the tension in the air. As soon as the metal structure opened, revealing the car, Karen practically threw herself inside. She slammed the door shut, started the engine, and for a second I thought she was going to reverse at full speed just to scare me. But then, instead of leaving immediately, she rolled down the car window and looked at me, her eyes shining with a mix of anger and resentment. That was extremely childish of you. You've lost a friend. I blinked, surprised by the choice of words. Karen, I was never your friend. She narrowed her eyes, shot me a look of pure contempt, and abruptly sped off, leaving the shed and turning the corner so quickly that she nearly tipped the bin over on the pavement. I stood there, watching the car disappear in the distance, as silence reclaimed the neighborhood. Finally, the nightmare was over. I turned my back, locked the shed once more, now only with my own belongings inside, and walked back home, feeling that, for the first time in a long while, I could relax without the fear of finding an unwanted car on my property. Karen could hate me for the rest of her life. She could spread rumors about how I was a terrible neighbor, tell her twisted version to anyone who would listen. But I didn't care. She would never dare to park in my shed again, and that alone made it all worth it. After Karen sped off from my property, I stood there for a moment, soaking in the newly acquired peace. The shed, now silent and empty, was finally my space again. I slammed the metal door shut with a satisfying bang and locked it calmly. This time, without any unwelcome intruder to worry about. I walked back home feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks, genuine relief. But at the same time, I knew it wasn't completely resolved yet. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat easily. She might have left, but there was still a chance she would try to get back at me in some way. And I wasn't wrong. Exactly 30 minutes after locking the shed, I heard my phone vibrate on the table. I picked up the device and saw Karen's name flashing on the screen. I smiled. Now that she was out of the situation, she had probably had time to think and craft some dramatic speech. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. 2 minutes later, she tried again. And when she saw I wasn't answering, she decided to go for the classic Karen alternative. Passive-aggressive text messages. You were extremely rude today. I would never expect that from a neighbor. I rolled my eyes. Oh, of course, because now I should be concerned about maintaining a friendly relationship with someone who treated my property like a personal parking lot. You could have been an adult and just called me over the weekend, but instead, you chose to be childish and vengeful. That says a lot about you. I laughed to myself. Funny how, in her mind, I was the wrong one, as if I were the villain of the story for not being willing to be exploited. I took a deep breath before typing a response. Karen, I warned you several times that you couldn't park there. You ignored it. It wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. You did it on purpose. So if you felt bothered, it's just because you finally had to deal with the consequences of your action. She read the message right away but didn't reply. I sighed, put my phone aside, and went about my life. For me, the story was over, but Karen wasn't finished yet. The next morning, when I went out for a walk, I found two neighbors whispering on the pavement. As soon as they saw me, they fell silent and tried to act casual. I just raised an eyebrow but kept walking as if I hadn't noticed. However, it didn't take long for me to understand what was happening. Karen was spreading her version of the story. Throughout the day, I noticed some people looking at me strangely. One even avoided me when I tried to greet them. I found it amusing. She was really trying to paint me as the monster of the neighborhood. And of course, like every good Karen, she had completely distorted the facts. By late afternoon, another neighbor, the same one who had told me about her trip over the weekend, passed by my house and stopped to chat. Dude, Karen's spreading that you kidnapped her car and did it just to get back at her for something. I couldn't help it and burst out laughing. Kidnapped? Seriously? Yes, she's saying you kept her from leaving, that you acted on purpose just to make her life hell. And did she mention the fact that she parked on my property without permission? Not exactly. And did she mention that she ignored my messages before going away? Not that either. Ah, well, what a surprise. The neighbor laughed and shrugged. Don't worry. Most people already know her reputation. But I thought you should know. I thanked him for the info but didn't worry too much. Anyone who knew Karen knew exactly what kind of person she was. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. In the following days, the buzz about the kidnapped car scandal started to fade. Gradually, people stopped commenting on it and went on with their lives. But Karen? Well, she never tried to park in my shed again. Not once. A few weeks later, I saw her house listed for rent. She was moving out. I don't know if it was because of the situation with me or if she just decided it was time to go. But the truth is, I never had to deal with her nonsense again. A new tenant moved into her house, and for the first time in a long while, the neighborhood became peaceful again. And every time I walk past the shed and see it free of any intrusive cars, I feel an inexplicable satisfaction. In the end, I won. The days following Karen's departure were filled with an almost surreal peace. I no longer had to worry about looking at the front of my shed, fearing I would find an unsanctioned car parked there. I didn't have to knock on anyone's door to ask them to respect my property. For the first time in months, I felt in control of my own space again. At first, I admit I was still vigilant, a bit paranoid. I knew Karen well enough to know she didn't handle defeat well. For a while, I imagined that maybe she would try one last-ditch effort, perhaps spread more rumors, create a final scandal, or even leave another car in my shed as a last provocation. But none of that happened. Karen simply vanished from my life. The neighborhood also seemed lighter. Without her around, there were no more arguments over the most absurd things, like the placement of the bins, the noise of lawn mowers, or how many cars someone could park on the street without her deeming it disrespectful. It was only then that I realized how much she had managed to turn something simple into a constant problem for everyone. The confirmation that she had truly left came a few weeks later when I saw her house being advertised for rent. The relief was immediate. I knew that wherever she was probably already making new enemies, but that was no longer my problem. One day, as I was leaving home to go to the shops, I ran into the neighbor who had alerted me about Karen's trip. He had one of those smiles that suggested he had some fresh gossip to share. "You won't believe it," he said, shaking his head. "What now?" I asked, already curious. "It seems Karen got into a fight in her new neighborhood. She got furious because someone parked too close to her house." I blinked a few times, absorbing the irony of the situation, and then I started to laugh. "Oh, of course. So when it's her car, it's fine. But when someone does the same to her," he shrugged. "Some people just don't learn." And that was the big lesson for me. Karen would never change. She could move to the other side of the country, meet different neighbors, start fresh. But as long as she refused to recognize that the problem lay in her own behavior, nothing would change. This made me realize something important. It's pointless to argue with someone who doesn't want to listen. Some people just believe the world revolves around them, and any attempt to make them see reality is a battle lost from the start. But I learned my lesson. If another Karen crosses my path one day, I already know exactly what to do. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to deal with a Karen or an unbearable neighbor? How did you resolve the situation? Tell me in the comments. I bet there are plenty of good stories out there. And of course, if you liked the video, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell. That way, you won't miss any new content. And who knows, you might even learn some strategies for dealing with unbearable people in the future. Until the next video.